Tim, how are you?
I'm good. Lovely to see you.
Well, good to see you too. And I'm sorry I haven't had time to check out your book that you sent. I've got a stack, and I'm trying to work my way through it, but I'm glad we at least have a chance to talk. I'd like to kind of trade some ideas and all of that.
Perfect. Yes, I understand completely about the books. In fact, I get to the point where I'm always a little bit nervous about giving them because I know what my stack looks like from all the ones that I'm given, and so I know how big yours must be.
Well, it's all very exciting, but trying to stay on top of it and do all the writing and other things that we're doing, and also keep going with all the books that come in, because we get several every week. So it's
yeah, I
very
understand
exciting
completely.
time, though. I mean, what I see in it all is some tremendous progress being made, and getting to some real answers that I think humans have been looking for thousands of years. So I think it's all very satisfying work, but
Well, let's go
moving at
straight
a
in on
quick
that
pace.
then, Eben. What do you think is the progress that's being made? That's a nice optimistic start to a conversation.
Well, I mean, the way I see all of this is from the kind of perspective of, a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist interested in the brain-mind connection. And we take so much for granted about this world around us that in many ways our understanding of that has been built up on false assumptions, and especially about physicality, about the physical universe being the only thing that exists. And of course, that was my kind of default position before my coma. And I'd spent a lot of my earlier life wanting to believe a lot of the kind of religious things I'd been taught in a Methodist church growing up in North Carolina. But then in all those decades spent as an academic neurosurgeon, it was just very confusing to me how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. And then when I had my experience, what it showed me very clearly is the brain doesn't create consciousness at all. So get over that. There's much more to this universe than just the physical. And of course, when you get deep down into quantum physics, they've been saying the same thing for 80 years. And just when you follow the progression, I don't know how aware you are of all of that, but if you
Yeah,
follow that
very.
whole line of experimentation and interpretation, you realize that, in fact, quantum physics and modern science is right there at the forefront of telling us, this is a spiritual universe and we're spiritual beings. And if you try and pretend that all of this is, just some blind mechanistic kind of circus of subatomic particles following the laws of physics and chemistry, and that determines all of emergent reality, you're missing something very big about what quantum physics is trying to tell us. And I think especially, I often talk about consilience, which is the notion that very widely disparate lines of inquiry can lead to the same kind of conclusions. And for me, for example, that includes coming at it as a neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, the hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers pointed out in the mid-90s, is much more than just a hard problem. It's actually an impossible problem if you subscribe to the myth of physicalism. And really, the whole world opens up to much greater possibilities when we move beyond the restrictions of physicalism that, in their strongest form, deny any such thing as free will, and try and pretend that this thing we call consciousness is just the epiphenomenon or illusion generated by subatomic particles following laws of physics and chemistry in the brain. And that's where the whole thing just kind of falls apart. And you realize, no, there's a much better way to look at it all. And of course, I don't know if you've read our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, but it goes into a lot of detail about how a modern version of objective idealism, or metaphysical,
Yeah, I understand.
metaphysical ontological idealism, but they're all kind of the same package. of showing us a mental universe. And in quantum physics, a
So
mental universe is already a concept they're used to.
I think it's interesting because I think in some ways, I've been on the opposite journey to you.
Uh-huh.
So for me, physicalism always seemed ridiculous. I had
Right.
my first awakening when I was 12. I've been exploring spirituality and spiritual experiences in every damn way I possibly could for 45 something more years.
Uh-huh.
And and that's been an in-depth study, written all these 35 books, all of this stuff, the vast majority of which take that idealist, for want of a better word, consciousness-based approach, including with quantum physics and so on. But interestingly, right now, I'm writing a book really saying why I was wrong, and but not to head back to physicalism. Physicalism
Right.
just
That
was
didn't
like, no,
work.
that's not it.
Sorry.
But I'm no longer convinced that idealist perspective is the actual solution we're looking for. I think it might be a different one. And I'd love to get into that with you. But before we do, just too much of good an opportunity. Because you've, I love talking to people who've had near-death experiences. I've been around them, again, when I was a teenager. I think I was one of the first people to join the International Association of Near-Death Studies when it was very first set up
Wow,
as
that's
a kid,
great.
because it
Uh-huh.
just felt like, well, that's what I want to know. And I've worked with death a lot of my life. So I'd really like to get your understanding where you've arrived at in terms of how you see that experience you had, the visionary experience, and this experience you're having now with me, how you see them as related, and what and how, and the difference for you between what most people are used to, which is just subjective dreams, and that sense of being something which is beyond a dream and yet seems to have similar qualities to it in lots of ways.
Right. Well, the first thing I would point out is that near-death experiences, by and large, not just from my own experience, but from reading and meeting thousands of people who have had them, the general descriptor is that realm is much more vibrant, alive,
Sure.
real than this one. This one
Mm-hmm.
is more of the dreamlike realm. And that's a really crucial thing for people to get, because ultimately, the way I would say the current scientific discussion is framed around this is people from a position of observing in this material world of ours and trying to understand consciousness within this material world, they treat those alternate realms and descriptions as if they are some form of, hallucination or psychedelic kind of experience or something, but they don't treat it as on par with existence in this world.
Sure.
And I think that leads to a lot of trouble. And the way out of that is to develop techniques of driving deep spiritual experience, transcendental consciousness from here, and that's what our work I do with Karen Newell, with my life partner, who is the founder of Sacred Acoustics. And I don't know if you're at all familiar with binaural beats
I have a CD out with them, actually.
Okay, well, good. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Sacred Acoustics, but bottom line is I've been using Sacred Acoustics tones for meditation daily for an hour, 2 or 3 a day for the last 9 years. And I've used them to return to those realms and not just recover memories of my NDE, but to actually develop profound relationships with all that I encountered in those realms. And it is doable through meditation, but you can't just drive it at will. I mean, this is how you set the stage, is intentional journeys into consciousness and deep meditation. And especially when you look at kind of our view that we talk about in Living in a Mindful Universe, it flips and comes down with a model of metaphysical, / objective idealism.
That's the bit
That
I want
really
to get.
just,
That's the bit I want to get. How you've understood it. It's the.
okay.
I mean, I think for the purposes of our conversation, we could just take for granted, look, that's real. And for me, it's an emergent reality. I know it from different experiences over many long periods. The question I have that is interesting me from your unique perspective is how you had this amazing visionary experience. In what way do you feel it was the beings, for want of a better word, that you encountered, in what way they seem to have their own identity rather than, say, you know, I've had experiences of meeting my dead mum where it was like, there's my mum. And I've had experiences in a dream where I've met a famous person and it feels like, no, that's a projection of my own imagination. And what that meant to you, that's one question. Let me start with that one. Let's go.
Well, let's start with that. And what I would say, again, if you do read Living in a Mindful Universe, I tell the story in there of basically my father. He had passed over, my adoptive father, neurosurgeon, very influential in my life. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. And he was nowhere to be found in my near-death experience. You know, there was not a whisper of him. But again, the other thing to explain about my NDE is that it had an unusual feature in that I was amnesic. I had no memories. I had no words, no language, no knowledge of Earth, this universe, none of Eben Alexander's personal experience. Every bit of it was gone. And of course, in the early months after my coma, you know, as a neurosurgeon, and when I first came back from my coma, my brain was really wrecked. In fact, in the first, hour or two of my coming to conscious awareness in the ICU bed, I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons. I just had no idea who they were. So, and my brain and, you know, mental kind of aspects of my brain took about 2 months to fully recover. But initially I was, you know, all my neuroscience knowledge was gone too. So all I could do is just buy what my doctors told me about things. And I knew my experience I had had. That was burned into my memory. And so I initially assumed that it made sense that I would be amnesic, because I was just gleaning all the information from my doctors and medical records about the extensive damage to my neocortex. And what they knew was my neurologic exams, my CT and MRI scans, all showed, you know, global disruption of my neocortex. All 8 lobes were involved. There was full thickness involvement in that the edema in the deep layers of the neocortex was, you couldn't even see the gray-white junction. So, I mean, it was a very extensive and destructive illness. Of course, the big mystery was how all those memories came back, because in fact, there was evidence beyond that 2-month time point that they were more complete memories than they had been before coma. And that part was a real shocker. And we discuss all that too in Living in a Mindful Universe, because the evidence that memory is not stored in the brain is something neurosurgeons have kind of considered as a strong possibility for decades. The reason being that out of the millions of brain resections we've done over the last century, there has never been a case of broad swathes of long-term memories that disappeared with a certain surgical resection. So, you know, the assumption that memories are stored in the physical brain, especially in the neocortex, is one that is denied by the evidence of neurosurgeons. And we've mused about that for a long time. But the problem is that concept of memories not being stored in the brain is such a giant nail in the coffin of physicalism that we haven't really discussed it robustly as a group, because it's so completely upending of the old world view. But it's something we discuss in detail in Living in a Mindful Universe, is the evidence that memory is not stored in the brain. But it's
so let me return to the I mean, by the way, I find that fascinating and intersects with stuff that I'm writing myself at the moment around exactly that. And I'd love to get into maybe we'll just do that for a second. My own underlying thesis in the philosophy that I've been exploring is that that we need to understand the existence of the past. So what strikes me about this moment is that it contains implicitly within it everything that's ever happened before.
Right.
and it wouldn't be this moment if it wasn't. And therefore, the past hasn't gone anywhere. And that actually we need to see time as an unfolding and an accumulation of information. So it seems very likely to me, once you have that view of the universe actually being a process made of time rather than a thing made of matter, then I would expect that memory is in some form, well, everything I suspect is relating to the past, like people like Charles Peirce and Rupert Sheldrake have said, that everything is an expression of what's happened before, and that therefore memory is a way of connecting back in the moment,
either
directly or conceptually.
Add at this point in the discussion is, remember that there are also aspects of the future that can come into the present very strongly, and that then become the future. And this whole discussion takes me back a step to reconsider the point I was making a few minutes ago about the ultra reality of those realms. And I point out very specifically the life review. Life reviews have been around in NDEs for thousands of years.
You didn't have one of those, presumably.
Well, I didn't, but what I did see was, in the generic sense, given my amnesia for my life, I saw life reviews beautifully, and I saw reincarnation beautifully, just not for Eben Alexander. So I saw the whole pattern, and the way I saw reincarnation in life reviews was really in two very powerful visual motifs that were deep in the midst of my coma. One was this vision of this interwoven tapestry of all these silvery and golden threads that were interwoven, and they were basically showing the weave of, it's almost like breathing, being in this incarnation in the physical realm, and then we have that break between lives. Reuniting with higher soul, going through life reviews of souls of departed loved ones, reshuffling, planning the next incarnation, then diving back in. So I saw it as both a tapestry with all the richness of the life review and the in and out of the material realm, and the progression. So it was not just looking at reincarnation as just, oh, well, someday you can get off the wheel of suffering. This was actually directed. It was going towards what I would call an omega point. It was going towards kind of a Christ consciousness, like Teilhard de Chardin discussed in Phenomena of Man. But I saw it in these two very brilliant ways. The tapestry was one, and the other was this absolutely lovely kind of living of an experience of flying fish. And the flying fish would be down in the material realm, and we'd be living these lives dumbed down, not knowing what our higher souls knew. And then we'd pop back up out of the water, reunite, come up with the next incarnation and the lessons to be taught and learned in that, and then dive back in, being, again, the main memories all being removed. There's a process of programmed forgetting. Just like dreams are very important. We know that because if people can't sleep and dream for a few weeks, they basically die. It's a very, like in familial insomnia, it's a very deadly disease. But likewise, I would point out that if you look at the reincarnation literature out of University of Virginia, Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker's work, 2,500 cases plus past life memories in children over the last 6 decades, suggestive of reincarnation. They'll tell you that if you don't harvest those memories by about age 6, they get covered over. There are processes of programmed forgetting that prevent us in this material incarnation from necessarily having full access to all the information that we can glean between lives, dreams, reincarnation literature, etc. So it's just a much bigger theater of operations. But that's where I believe that the model we point out in Living in a Mindful Universe, which basically flips all this by looking at the brain as a filter. That's an old model. William James, Henri Bergson, F.C.S. Schiller, Aldous Huxley, and others all talked about, the kind of filter theory. And so basically in our book, we just take that to the next level.
Why? You see, I have a problem with that.
Okay.
And did you see I sent you, when we first made contact, I don't know if you had the chance to see it, it's very short, was my TED Talk.
I haven't seen that yet.
Okay, so might be worth taking a look. It's only 10 minutes, but it's a very short, condensed version of a thesis, because the problem that I have with the whole filter model, it's the kind of top-down model, which is what idealism has. Is it ultimately it feels very negative about this. It's like, this is a filter, this is less, this is forgetting, this is someone we've fallen into. What is the relationship exactly between this realm and that realm? That realm seems more real. This realm seems less real.
Except I would make one point.
Okay.
And that point is that I would say the whole reason for existence of the universe is for the evolution of consciousness.
Right. I agree with you. Totally.
And I would also say that just like that old saying, all politics is local, all evolution of consciousness is nothing more than individual souls coming to these aha moments of discovery through learning and teaching in soul school, which is here. This is where all the work gets done. So as much as people worry, this is all an illusion, this is the Maya, this is not as it appears, but never forget, this is the reason the whole universe exists, because in those more real realms, that's not actually where we make progress.
Okay, so I get that. I mean, it's a story I've heard for decades, and I've taught it myself at various points. It's a good story. Let me throw you a possibility just to get your reaction. See, what strikes me, like I said earlier about the moment, when I look at the moment, which is basically what I do, what I see about it is two things. One is that everything that's ever happened is implicit within it. There's a flow of time happening, always. And each moment realizes a new possibility based on what happened before. And we have this amazing story, as you say, we've got this amazing story through science, which is an incredible story, I think, of the evolving universe for 14 billion years. Coming, and so the way of understanding what's happened for you and for so many others that I'm playing with is, can we understand reality as the realization of ever more emergent possibilities, that that's what it is, and that rather than it coming down from somewhere, it's rising up, so that it does start with the most basic things, basic matter and so forth, and from that will come life, and from that will come sentience, consciousness of the body, and from that will come images of sentience, which is the psyche. And the bit which I'm kind of playing with, which is obviously controversial but seems interesting to me, is whether we can see that realm, the bardos, the imaginal realm, the soul dimension, which I've spent my life exploring and which you've gone deeply into in depth, as the most emergent level of this evolutionary process. So the role that this is playing is not filtering it, it's actually supporting it. It's a place which has allowed it to emerge, and that's why the images which are people are actually images from here. They come from somewhere, and they themselves have come through the evolutionary process, which has led us up to something which actually transcends material, a non-material realm having evolved from a material realm. And of course, we're in it now. We're already in that. All our thoughts are happening in that realm right now.
Right. Well, I believe in many ways we're kind of in agreement on this. Kind of the way I see it. I must say I do believe that there's kind of a world of forms, as Plato discussed. A world of ideals, and it actually is a world of ideals of individual souls, and they're fitting into this whole process of growth and learning.
Why do you believe that, Eben?
Sorry?
Why do you believe that?
Basically, it's kind of what I witnessed during my journey, and it's something that I've seen over and over again in my meditation. In fact, I would go so far. It in some ways, I guess it echoes Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenetic fields, but it's that there is kind of a world of ideals that serves as a template, and that allows this top-down propagation of what we see presented on the stage.
So you're saying it in a Platonic way, that these ideals, this is kind of a lesser echo of those ideals, rather than, I think what Rupert's saying, in that instance, what he's saying, he's Platonist in other ways, but in that instance, I think what Rupert's saying is that is that the morphic genetic fields are evolutionary. So they're
Right.
forming. And
Right.
that's how more I would see it.
That's a huge part of the way I would explain it.
Okay.
And yet the interesting thing is, so many people who, working on this issue now, the mind-brain connection and all that, will point to the fact that you cannot reduce it all to materialism. That just really doesn't work. So yes, we all kind of default into a position kind of like Descartes and, a dualistic look at, mind, the spirit and the material aspects of a human being. But I think that in many ways, this evolutionary process is, and the point I was going to make is they often then go to, well, we know there's more than just the material. Maybe we can explain that through panpsychism, that there are some kind of elements of proto-consciousness that are there with all the subatomic particles. From my point of view, that's a complete cop-out. It's a materialist position that's just admitting that the data shows materialism is wrong, but it's trying to put Band-Aids all over the materialist model to force it to still work. And that's where I believe we have to go to pure idealism.
Let me give you a different version of panpsychism then. How about this?
Okay.
How about, it's not panpsychism, but it shares something in common. How about, look, there's an evolutionary process which starts from the simplest and is moving into the more emergent. And that process, this flow of form, which is arising from formless potentiality, is individuating into individual time streams, actually, not things, processes. And we can see that everywhere. Like, so from hydrogen and helium onwards, things have been individuating, whether it's an atom or a molecule or whatever it is.
Right.
As soon as you've got an individual, you've got something in relationship to the whole. So what you haven't got is consciousness or psyche remotely. But what you do have is subject and object, because it has a subjective electromagnetic relationship with the whole. Mm-hmm. And that the evolutionary process will always be a relationship between subject and object the whole way up, and that they will evolve in tandem, so that as we reach life, that subjective and objective nature becomes very, very rich. Eventually that subjectivity will become sensation, will become attention, which is consciousness, being able to pay attention to things. And then from that will come this other domain that you and I are in right now, having this conversation, of psyche, which is non-material. Right. And actually, in my view, exists as an independent realm, which has arisen from the realm of biology. So that you've got this kind of movement. You haven't got a kind of crass, there's consciousness at the beginning, but not, you've made molecules consciousness, but they're all subjects, and that subjectivity will evolve. And then you avoid what seems to me one of the big problems with idealism, which is you're taking one of the most emergent things, consciousness, and we'd have to work out what we mean by that as well, and putting it at the beginning. And it feels like the God trick. It just feels like you just put the big thing at the beginning. Whereas actually it looks like consciousness is emergent. And like you said, we're growing in it. It's not like there, it's actually it's increasing, and we're moving towards it, as Teilhard de Chardin says.
Yeah, I think the way I would adjust that view slightly to kind of follow my line of thinking about it is I view what we'll call, just for a moment, consciousness as self-awareness.
Self-awareness, okay.
Let's view that as a level of information integration in the universe that is primordial. In other words, that is a level, and if we are then to try and build in quantum physics, for example, I would point to the writings of George F.R. Ellis, the South African mathematician, who's written extensively on top-down causal influences in setting up the whole world of quantum physics. And from my point of view, and so, various people in physics have kind of laid this out in different ways. Another example would be,
so how is this primordial? Sorry, I'm losing it. So you've got a primordial consciousness, which is something aware of itself.
Right.
And it's information. And it's
that is the thing that's actually doing the evolving. And that is I would like to look at each and every one of us as our kind of conscious experience as being facets on the surface of a diamond, so that we're all part of the one mind. We just have slightly different perspectives, and it's those different perspectives that allow this bigger thing of consciousness to grow. But the mistake, from my point of view, is trying to say that consciousness or self-awareness evolved in the biological kingdom as some kind of an adaptation or what have you. I believe that the self-awareness is part of the universe itself, and that is something that we come much more in touch with when we leave the physical realm, like in the dream space, in NDEs, in deep meditation. Psychedelic drug experiences in many ways can offer another kind of view into this, but that ultimately we're talking about accessing a realm of information assimilation and integration in the universe that pre-exists the Big Bang, and that is what we call consciousness.
So it's an interesting experience for me recently, Eben, because what you're saying could be from one of my books, and yet I'm here disagreeing with it, because the process I've been over the last few years has led me to think, no, this doesn't quite work, but I'm incredibly familiar with what you're saying and right. Know it intimately and respect it, and fundamentally I'm trying to articulate the same intuitions.
Right.
But as a philosopher, it just feels like we need to articulate it differently for me.
Right.
So if I'm going to, the problem for me is if I have a choice between going, the ground is consciousness. Now here, the word's used in a lot of different ways, but the way you're using it seems more like the kind of the Hindi idea of pure self-knowledge at the beginning, something, but it's also got information in it, it seems.
Right.
And it is, it's doing the evolving. So it's kind of Brahman, dreaming the universe.
Right.
So again, it's like, that's a big thing to put at the beginning. How about this at the beginning? And which is just to say, look, what can we say about where the universe has come from? And this is actually from Brian Swim, the cosmologist, reading him years ago, and it stayed with me is a great insight. Well, one thing we can say for sure is that it came from the potentiality for the universe.
Right.
So what happens if we just say, look, what's there at the beginning is the potentiality for everything. Let's call it, the word I like now from Plato is being, something which is but has no qualities apart from it can become everything. Right. So the fundamental nature of the universe isn't something which already knows itself and da-da-da. It's actually the fundamental ground of the universe, which is emerging from, is something that could be anything. Right. And it is in the process of becoming everything.
Correct.
And what will emerge as that happens is ever more complexity and ever more emergent qualities, which will lead to self-knowledge.
Right.
And the omega point it's going to is the universe in self-knowledge, like God. It's growing into that thing. It's not coming from that thing. It's flowering as that thing which we experience in higher realms. And the reason that they're higher realms is not because we've fallen from them, but because we're growing up into them, and that they are the latest thing, which is why they feel more real when you're launched into them. I just had as it happens, I had it just 2 weeks ago. I had the most extreme experience I've ever had of the love light, of just no Tim, no thought, just God.
No.
And I hadn't had it like that before.
No.
Oh, Eben, I've lost you for a second there. And so it's like, feels like the most emergent. That feels like that's where it's, to me, that's where it's going. So that's the alternative, which I've ended up wanting to play with. So what do you make of that, my friend?
Well, I think in many ways, I can accept all of that as kind of a work in progress towards, a deeper understanding. Now, I think we're still just way too much in the dark about things, even as simple as time. Time is completely misunderstood by modern, or just not understood by modern physics. And the other point I'd like to make is getting back to something I said a few minutes ago about life reviews and the future, and how the future in many ways has some parallels with the past. And the thing that's really big and magical is the now. but the now is always kind of an assembly of, of past events and future possibilities, in many ways, though, acknowledging how much the future seems to be written in. For example, I would say that one of the other beliefs I've come to harbor about all this is I believe that in many ways we, you know, we die, reunite with a higher soul, members of the soul group, and then I believe we plan the next incarnation. We shift roles. Sometimes a parent becomes a child and vice versa, and all of these kind of things can flip and flop. You know, our gender identity can change between incarnations, all of that for the setting of the stage for the next incarnation, but it's always done with a certain intention of certain challenges. And I would say that the way I see it now, and this comes from not only my experience, but conversations with many people who've had NDEs, shared death experiences, after-death communications, deathbed visions, all the various kind of combinations of this, is realizing that the hardships, you know, illness, injury, things like that, are the stepping stones that we line up as kind of a soul contract in advance. So in other words, in certain ways, you can say that parts of our individual futures are, you know, predetermined, quote unquote. But I would say where the free will comes into it is how in each incarnation we and as we progress through an incarnation, how we address those hardships, and are we able to strengthen various lessons that we're here to learn from the universe? For example, a sense of loving connection with purpose, of my role in the universe going forward.
How do you get over the problems with that, though, Eben? Because I mean, again, you know, this is a familiar idea to me, and a very, very common notion in spirituality, especially over the last period. Few decades, and I mean, and that's interesting. A lot of people hold it. I also think, from experience, that there is a sense of destiny to certain experiences one has. We need to understand that. I think synchronicities happen. I think sometimes precognition happens in certain ways. All of these things are mysteries which, as a philosopher, I'm concerned with a lot to find explanations for. The problem I have with the traditional view that you're putting forward there, is that it's like, you know, I remember being with Ram Dass years ago, who I love and respect immensely, and him talking about, you know, people having contracts to murder each other and all sorts which at the time felt like, wow, that's amazing, which doesn't feel that amazing now. It feels like, really? Because how would that possibly work, that you could have that freedom? You know, there's something solipsistic about it. It works great if it's just me. You know, if my agenda is to go through these hardships and I need someone to treat me badly and I need this to happen and a car crash to occur and all that in order for me to go through it. But then all those other people are kind of like just pawns and doing terrible things sometimes. And yet they don't have the choice to go, no, I'm not, they're not learning. That it doesn't make sense to me
Well,
anymore.
I would say that we all are responsible for our choices. I don't see anybody as a pawn. And the other thing about the solipsism and idealism is to point out quantum physics is very clear on showing us that the reality we experience is absolutely dependent on that observing consciousness.
Oh, I completely disagree with you there. I think that is not true. Not true. I hear it repeated all the time, and I don't think quantum physics is saying that. It seems to me that, I mean, not least because the collapse of the waveform happens through not through conscious observation, but through measurement, which doesn't need a conscious observer. So it seems much more.
What would be your kind of preferred interpretation of the measurement paradox?
Well, for me, it fits in very much with what I was saying about the whole universe being both subject and object. That the universe is experiencing, or that's probably too strong a word, but it's receiving itself in every, or observing itself in every individuated form. So when a possibility hits an actuality, it collapses. And until then, it doesn't, because you're actually looking at, and when I said, look, the whole thing looks like it's the constant realization of possibilities, then you go down to the lowest level and you can see it happening. And it does it. And when does it realize? Well, the minute it comes into contact with an actuality. And as soon as you do that, it's going to start taking shape and form. And then when you reach this level, of course, it's pretty solid, which is why the observer, contrary to what they say in The Secret, you can't just observe something and go, oh, elephant, and an elephant doesn't appear. Because actually we've reached a level of emergence where, based on that primal realization of possibilities, it's much more solid and continuous. And then what surely marks out the experiences of the dream world and the after-death world and the bardos or whatever, the imaginal realms, is that suddenly, because it's a world of images, because it isn't made of matter, it's suddenly all freed up. That suddenly it's plastic. So fishes can fly and people can turn into each other and forms can morph, and that you're in the world we're in now sharing these ideas. But that doesn't...
I would just say that there's kind of a difference between what you can imagine and what is presented to you by the universe in those realms.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to understand. That takes us right back to the beginning of the conversation, because that's the key bit for me that I would love to get your insights on, which is, I want to say, in the philosophy I'm exploring, that there is that the psyche is not the subjective aspect of the body. It's a whole realm, both subjective and objective.
Right.
And it sounds to me like you have directly experienced that in a very vivid way. I have too, but not in the way you have. And I wanted to know how you understand that.
Well, I think, for me, that conscious awareness comes to its fullest form. For example, for me, in the core realm of my NDE, which was that pure oneness with that creative force throughout all eternity, infinity, and the connection was all one of kind of the infinite healing power of love, of the oneness of being and of the optimal evolution of the universe. I mean, I have kind of a strong sense of this, of how that world of ideals works, and especially kind of engendered by the life review and descriptions of life review, and how when you go through those events, it's not some vague memory. You actually relive it in very profound form. And not only that, you don't do it from your own point of view. That's probably the most important feature of the life review, is you experience it as the emotional awareness of those around you who were influenced by not only your actions, but even your thoughts. So it's a much richer kind of theater of operation that kind of looks backstage as these events are happening. But the life review, as it presents to people, for example, in a near-death experience, is a very profound example of the reality of that world of ideals, and how things, it kind of reminds us that what we experience, going through our life moment to moment in this material realm, in many ways does have a lot of the actuality kind of built into it moving forward in the future. And yet I would say that the free will is really how we interact with those challenges. And I know you're having trouble with that it's something you considered long ago as real, but now you've dismissed.
Essentially, I want to follow the same thing. I want to pull you back a bit. Because the bit I want to understand from what you're saying, which intrigues, is that. So I understand the idea that you enter a state. There's a dream where I'm projecting something. There's the state you're describing where the universe presents you with something. What about where you and I meet in the bardos? What control have we got over how it seems? Can we create things in your view? How does the interaction of independent beings within the imaginal realm work? And did you experience that, and what did you make of it?
Well, in many ways, I think I did. And I think it has to do with the fact that again, my kind of bigger default model of this is one mind, that there really is one mind, one consciousness. And it's not human at all. We can fool ourselves into thinking, oh, that can't be ultimate because it's too similar to human kind of psyche. Um, but the consciousness and self-awareness I'm talking about is one that really goes way down in the evolutionary chain, certainly, and it has manifested in animals and plants, and in the world at large, going back before that, the material world, completely absent any kind of biological systems. And so I really see that conscious awareness is something that is only parceled out into these apparent different facets of understanding. And I'm not sure if I'm really, um, I mean, the way I see it in terms of free will, I think I'm kind of getting
Not,
at your
not, not
question.
so much. Sorry, I'm not really talking about free will, and I'm
Right.
apologies if
Yeah,
I've
I think you're
misled you.
talking more about kind of the human experience of interacting with that world and how much of it is kind of from the universe versus how much of it would have anything to do with the soul selecting its pathway of living.
Yeah,
Is that
and just for instance, I'm no matter what I do, I'm going to look like this right now, but in my imagination, I can look like anything,
right?
and my room is going to stay like this. But if I imagine it, I can turn it into anything. So it intrigues me, and that's why we tend to see that as purely a subjective dream, and that's why it gets dismissed.
Uh-huh.
But if you and I can meet in that realm, if we can go into deeper states of the imaginal realms and actually connect, how are we connecting now? Because I'm not this. There's no fixed thing. I'm a
Right.
fluid thing. So can we, when I had an experience 6 months after my mother died of meeting my mum, and she definitely was morphing into all different shapes and sizes of who she'd been and beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was intriguing to me. So I wanted to know for you how that landscape that you were in, was that for you the big mind? Was that also you interacting with the big mind? Did that help create it? Were the beings that you met projecting themselves as something? Were you projecting them as something? Do you know what I'm trying to explain here or
I
explore?
do. I see. It's a beautiful question, and to me, and it gets back to that whole big issue of solipsism versus something more. If you're talking about idealistic positions, um, and I think it's a beautiful question that teases out or can potentially tease out much more of this notion of the one mind and how it parcels out. Now, for me, kind of getting back to your question a few minutes ago, um, that one mind is something that I can experience here in this material realm in deep meditation. I can traverse the boundary and get into the realm of that one mind, just as I did in my NDE. The only thing I've not been able to duplicate in my meditative experience using sacred acoustics and that kind of approach is the absolute full-blown kind of ultra reality of it all. The real kind of helicopter top-down view of that includes tremendous sways of both time and space and levels of causality, potentialities mixed with actualities, that really big picture view that was so effortless in the NDE is something that is only a very kind of rare situation that I approach in my meditations, but I would not claim that I've ever duplicated it fully. But it's a fascinating question that to me gets back into focusing on this as the one mind. And again, for me as a neuroscientist, a lot of that thinking comes from the scientific world of, say, all the evidence for non-local consciousness, like the evidence behind telepathy, especially telepathy in twins, but of course telepathy occurs in many other circumstances. Precognition, the fact that we can know the future and demonstrate that in a laboratory setting, in some cases, before it happens. Um, uh, um, Psychokinesis, the ability to influence, material objects using mental power alone, which some people can do quite effectively, as studied in a scientific setting. So, in other words, that um, uh, kind of view of non-local consciousness, all the evidence we have, and of course I would include in that all the evidence you have from near-death experiences, shared death experiences, after-death communications, past life memories in children indicative of reincarnation. All of that is showing a much bigger kind of role, this non-local consciousness, showing how in a very real sense you can demonstrate the reality of that in this realm. And and in a scientific fashion, even though the scientific details are very elusive, as you know from studying the literature. It's the universe is holding some of these kind of secrets close to its chest. But I believe that that is where we're headed, and that individually we have the power to get into that. Now, the other point I'd like to make, though, is in terms of those life reviews and time flow, this is where, to me, it gets just fascinating, because, and I believe, getting back to what you were mentioning a few minutes ago, that what I experienced, if you read Proof of Heaven, and there's all that extensive discussion of the Gateway Valley, that kind of Earth-like realm, but that was not my ultimate lesson. And the ultimate lesson was really in the core. And I would ascend up through these portals, catalyzed by what I remembered as music or sound or vibration. Although, of course, in those realms, it's not being filtered through ears and you're not seeing through eyes. That's one of the reasons it's so difficult to come back from that kind of experience and explain it, put it in earthly words, because the kind of reality you experience with that full bore drinking from the fire hose of consciousness really doesn't fit into the language that we use to describe a trip to Disney World. And I think that's one of the problems. And that's why Karen and I, in our work in living in a mindful universe, and also I would like to point out to you that we have a companion workbook that goes with Living in Mindful Universe. It's a free online email course. So if you go to ebenalexander.com, there's a little banner that wiggles in your face, your 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness. And we've had more than 8,000 people around the world take that course to date. They all leave comments on the page, and they were all helping each other and sharing experience. So I would encourage you to take a little look at that email course and some of those comments if you want to kind of see how this kind of thinking evolves. And because a lot of what we think about it comes from these ongoing experiences in our workshops and with people who are participating in these kind of tools of deep psychic exploration to come to a better understanding of it. But I think ultimately the reason that I carry this argument for idealism beyond panpsychism and some of those other discussions is just what I've experienced in those alternate realms. It's just way too much to deny, and that's why I feel like
I don't think you have to. I don't think. I guess my own intersection with that, my as you can tell, my passion with that really is that I don't think idealism is. I don't think the choice is materialism or idealism. Right. I don't think the choice is it's all an object. No, it's all a subject.
I understand.
I think there's other options, and I think there's other options that can include the spiritual experience and make sense of it in a better way than idealism does. I mean, that's, this is a philosophical thing. And so I completely get all the arguments that you put forward for it. And I think all those things need explaining. I'm not completely convinced that idealism does explain them. I think what it does is it doesn't rule them out, which materialism does. So materialism can't cope. So that, and idealism seems attractive because it doesn't rule them out. It leaves them open. There could be a way that works. We don't know what. Whereas actually, I think what we need is a synthesis which helps us to start actually understanding how these processes might occur. But that's a whole nother long conversation.
Well, I think you're right there. That's essentially what I feel I'm trying to do. And the problem I have with all the various dualisms that try and combine a material universe that is going along by natural material physical laws combined with our spiritual aspects and the whole spiritual aspect of the universe and trying to blend those together is I feel like so many of the problems that we've encountered are because we try to do a Band-Aid fix on a version of materialism, even though we reject materialism because we kind of agree, no, it doesn't really answer all those big questions that come up around non-local consciousness and reincarnation and all that. So we reject pure materialism, but then we try and put band-aids on it. And from my point of view, especially having lived through multiple different layers.
What sort of things do you mean by that when you say talking about putting what sort of positions are you thinking of as being band-aid to materialism, of bringing the worlds together?
I see panpsychism is the one that is most of a violation, because basically it rejects so much more of the information that shows kind of a top-down organizational principle that would be looked at as kind of a God force. That is, one that has an interest in the personal soul going through an evolution. So in other words, a little different from Spinoza's God, from Einstein's God. But I think that that's what the story that near-death experiencers have been telling for thousands of years, is a oneness with that top-down causal force. That's what I experience, especially in the core realm. And the more people I meet...
It could be both, though, couldn't it, Eben? It could be both. It could be that the universe is as it appears to be, that time, by its very nature, actually, is the continual accumulation of information, which has a tendency, therefore, towards ever greater complexity, ever greater subjectivity, consciousness, and ever greater objectivity, that it has come through all of these different realms, and that, as far as we can tell, the very latest thing that's emerged is the psyche.
Although what I would caution you about that language is, if we're really agreeing that there is some top-down organizational force that plays a role at the level of quantum physics along the lines of what George F.R. Ellis and others talk about.
I'm not agreeing with that. I'm not agreeing with that. I don't think there's...
I hear you.
What I'm suggesting is that the top-down is that really the problem, I don't think, is materialism, actually, although I don't agree with materialism. The problem is reductionism.
Right.
The problem is the idea that the greater, more emergent levels of reality can be reduced to the lower levels. Whereas I feel I would call myself an emergentist, a spiritual emergentist, in that it feels like, no, the whole point is, if I'm made of chemical, my body is made of chemicals, but if the chemicals were sitting on this chair instead of me, the conversation, I hope, would not be as good. Something else has been added to chemicals.
Well, there's a lot more than just the chemicals.
Exactly.
Exactly. I mean, other way.
So if you remove that reductionism,
right,
and you actually go, no, what's happening is a bit like, hey, I was once an egg and a sperm, but I'm not really that. I'm really this.
Right.
But that's where I started as a body. So, and the universe the same. It's like it starts with hydrogen, but now look, it's become mind, and the downward thrust is happening. Look, I'm intending to make my body, I don't even know how it's doing it, but I'm intending, and then it's making these funny noises and passing information to you. That's all top down. So that the brain then becomes not so much a filter, but more like an interface. It's an interface between a non-material level, and it's passing both ways, isn't it? Because I'm hearing you, and that's going up, and that's coming down, and that therefore there is the top down. And if I would suggest that the one consciousness, the one knowing itself, is what's emerging, and it is also top down, but it doesn't.
I find all that very acceptable and aligned with a lot of how I would look at it. I think maybe another concept to throw in here, just to kind of help you see my perspective. This is really just a discussion of mind and matter and what is their intersection. Now, one thing that I've paid a lot of attention to over the last few years is placebo effect. Placebo effect is just a mind-bending example of how we live in a mental universe. And it's not just, you give somebody a sugar pill and tell them it might make their headache go away. I mean, if you go to noetic.org, to the Institute of Noetic Sciences website, and put in the search term spontaneous remission, you will get to a book that they published in the mid-90s. It's now out of press, but they'll give you the whole book online there. But it's more than 3,500 cases of spontaneous healing of cancers, advanced cancers, infections, congenital deformities, advanced degenerative diseases, things like that, that people basically reversed through their beliefs that they could get better. So independently of any kind of Western medical intervention, there are many stories where mind, and power, prayer, whatever you want to call it, these things end up driving a healing that has absolutely no explanation within Western medicine.
So isn't the issue this then, Eben? Or this is where I end up. This is where my book Soul Story starts, if you look at it.
Uh-huh.
Is an attempt to understand the paradox I find myself in, which is, on the one hand, that's true, and on the other hand, it's often not true. And I know tons of beautiful, amazing people who've not had that happen. And I have had moments in my life of utter magic where the synchronicities, it's felt like I'm in a dream, and not just once or twice, but over and over, and sometimes for long periods. And then there's been other times when it's felt very causal, and I'm going to suggest that when I drop this pen, it will fall. Oh, and I was right. And I think it's going to happen again. So how can I live in a universe which is this paradoxical, that on the one hand, it has a causality and a brutality to it, and a predictability to it. And on the other hand, it can be utterly magic, full of love, luminous, and miracles can happen. And it feels to me that the way that we can, the route to understanding that is to see it's not one or the other. Right. It's not the mind, it's all mind, because then that should happen all the time. And if it doesn't, it's fucked. But neither is it all matter. But actually, that the universe has become a mental universe. That something which is about narrative and story and dreams, has come out of something which is much more rigid.
Right.
And that's true, with my own birth, that happened. Something which was biological and chemical came out. And then the next thing I know, there was thoughts and dreams and adventures and stories and Tim. And that the whole universe is like that. But even though I am right now experiencing this amazing realm of meaning, my body still needs to eat and to be washed, and it goes wrong. And I can't control everything.
Right.
And that the universe is a bit like that too. And do you understand what I'm trying to play with?
I do. And the way I look at this is I often say in my talks, it's like a tango. It's like a beautiful dance between kind of that one mind and kind of the evolving consciousness and all the kind of warts and imperfections of these material beings that are souls living in that very pure world of ideals. And yet the school that is involved in the learning and teaching of these lessons, which is the actual evolution of consciousness itself, is this very imperfect world we find ourselves in. And the interesting thing, as you point out, is I think there are very deep and subtle nuances of lesson that we are to learn that have to do with that fine distinction that you're kind of talking about of our abilities to influence the world, and yet the other aspects of the world that seem to be kind of on autopilot and just going by their own machinations. But what I would try and point out there is I'd be cautious about assuming that this thing we call psyche, and especially self-awareness, is something that emerged from any kind of material universe. I think that's where people get into big trouble. From my point of view, it's much better to see that conscious awareness as a layer of integration and assimilation in the universe that has always existed, and in fact pre-existed.
We're talking like this often happens, I think, in this conversation. There's two, the word consciousness is used in lots of ways, of course, but there's two ways it's used, and I think you've used it in both ways there. No, I don't mean you've contradicted yourself. I don't mean to be, I'm not, I just mean in the conversation. Sometimes consciousness is used to refer to, especially in spirituality, kind of pure consciousness, the ground, the self-awareness. Other times it's used to actually refer to the contents of consciousness, the psyche or the sensations even, and that sort of stuff. So there's two different questions there. One is about what consciousness is, and whether it's the ground, and the other is, where does this world of images come from that we are conscious of? Like, just as I'm conscious of this world of physical forms. So it seems, okay, so look, I think I can say, from the point of view I'm trying to explore, the reason that we're learning this is because it's evolving, and it's moved from primitive states to more advanced states, so that the movement towards meaning and beauty and love is something which is emerging from it, and that therefore we're growing into it. And that's what the universe actually is. Now, I feel like that can account for all of these different things. How do you account for it? Why is this great mind, which is already there, putting us poor bastards through this horrible experience of death and loss and suffering and starvation and war and plague and the Middle Ages and toothache and all of that awful, and a whole planet of things that eat each other and little bugs that go into kids' brains and eat them from the inside out? Why would it do that? What lesson is there for a 6-month-old baby that's being eaten from the inside by a parasite?
Well, I can't, I don't have answers to all those questions. And I certainly realize there's a lot of apparent kind of darkness and badness in this universe. But I still believe that we can explain it as a process of growth. And I would say that the thing that is experiencing it, that one mind, in many ways, I love Elie Wiesel's, when he was challenged with this horrible hardship and what is this relationship of man and God? He just simply said, God loves story. And so in essence, he was kind of pointing out that kind of ultimate intelligence.
Is that a good answer, Eben? I find it's a funny answer.
It is a funny answer.
And I think God does love stories, because I think the universe has become a story. But as really, can you look in the eyes of a mother whose child has just died from cancer and go, well, God loves stories? It's no, I can't either. That would
be my answer to that woman. But the other thing,
it doesn't feel like an adequate answer at all to me.
No, it's not. But I think the other thing to point out here is that reincarnation, that was another aspect of reincarnation that was so apparent to me in my journey, was seeing especially the suffering of innocents, like children and animals. How could an infinitely loving God allow that to happen if that was their only little soul blip, was living in that one incarnation? And to me, that was just part of the bigger picture of the schools of flying fish and the beautiful tapestry, to show me about how the one mind is all about, multiple incarnations in this process of growth.
So I think what we're saying is incredibly close, and I would love to be able to just
convergence.
I would like to be able to state what the difference is, because there's a key difference, and it's the difference that I've been working on.
Can I make one other point that might help?
Yeah, please do, please.
And this is something that Karen and I do routinely in our workshops, is we help people to quickly get to a point, kind of in their prepping for meditations and things like that, to realize that the voice in the head, the little, stream of thoughts, voice of the ego, the little linguistic brain, it's sitting right here in Wernicke's area in my non-dominant dominant temporal lobe. That constructs this whole narrative of who we are and all, but that is not your consciousness. You can set that aside in meditation. And that's what at a very first step in our meditative programs, we teach people to do, is learn they are not identical with that stream of thoughts and that little ego story and their personal narrative going all the way back. Their consciousness is the awareness of that voice. And so the thing we teach them to do at a very early stage is to acknowledge the little voice in the head. That's our story. That's our, who Eben Alexander is those little thoughts and those memories and my life story from birth to now and all my experience. That is not the deep mystery. That is a parlor trick that this much brain is involved in taking command of. That's why we call this the
bit more than a parlor trick, Eben. I mean, it's 14 billion years to get to the point where we can think. You can't dismiss that as a parlor trick.
Remember,
I agree with you.
No. The
it's
voice
not,
in your
it's
head,
not the witness, but it's not nothing, is it?
It's how we communicate, but in many ways, I would say that rational, logical voice gets in the way of some of our deepest knowing. That's why the meditation and going within is so important, especially as you acknowledge that little linguistic system of organization is something that mainly serves to falsely separate you from the universe. That's what the whole problem with reductive materialist science is. The little voice in the head has been always telling us that this thing is separate from the universe. Whereas if you read Jill Bolte Taylor's My Stroke of Insight or watch her TED Talk, you'll see a perfect example of how much our linguistic brain, and specifically Wernicke's area, is there putting together all these notions of objects and interrelationships and interactivities and pretending that, you know, that's a model of reality. And what she saw with that linguistic part of her brain was destroyed was her boundaries of self expanded outward. She became one with the chair, the desk, the tree outside the window, the clouds in the sky, with this overwhelming sense of pure love and unification of every bit of it. And I would argue that that is a trick of the linguistic brain. That
So I would suggest it's just where you put your attention. If I put my attention onto my deep being, it's deep being, and you know, you can go so deeply into that. There's nothing else there, but there is something else, and then you can bring your attention back, and there's thinking, and thinking's fine, and thinking can be, well, it's ambiguous. Thinking can be rubbish. Thinking can be something you're stuck in. Thinking can be anxious. Thinking can be like this. Thinking can be insightful. Can be beautiful. Can be creative. Could be poetry. That it's a facility of our humanity. And it's a beautiful thing. It doesn't mean, you know, a bit like the body can be a pain.
But we also tend to give it a little too much credence as the ultimate arbiter of who we are and our narrative. And that's where I feel that meditation, especially that initially goes in and takes that little voice, the impish, annoying roommate, is the way Michael Singer calls that little voice in the head, and puts it into timeout. And that's where I believe we can allow you know, for a much richer kind of interaction with that primordial mind. And I realize that in so many ways, you know, people can just say, well, this is all just, you know, a trick of linguistic definitions of borders and parcellations within the realm of consciousness. And in many ways, I could say, yeah, I see that. But I believe that if you start hitting on the right organization there, and have continued and ongoing experiences I've tried to cultivate with my daily meditations, that you start to realize much more of a connection with the universe where your consciousness is not limited to, you know, something that exists.
Sure. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just,
definitely.
and again, it gets back to linguistic brain definitions of self-awareness and consciousness.
So the thing that we were on, I'm not sure quite how we got into the linguistic thing, but I mean, I hear what you're saying, and and you know, it's like, you know, you're definitely right in terms of, look, you know, if your attention is caught up in just thinking, you won't hear the silence, and you won't be able to experience the deeper aspects of the soul.
There's a lot more than silence that comes from the universe in that setting. So
absolutely, it's infinite.
Yeah, but there's more information that we can glean in those realms.
Definitely. So the thing that I wanted to just try and grab to kind of complete our journey, which is I'm very grateful to you for coming on and having the conversation.
My pleasure, and I appreciate your all your thoughts. Very helpful.
Is for me I think the problem, one of the biggest, almost like an emotional problem with the idea of the fall from big mind, or the idealist perspective, which I had myself, is there's something for me to utterly redemptive about the evolutionary idea. Because if God is all powerful and he does let babies' brains be eaten from the inside, even if it is only for one lifetime, you know, I don't like him. But if this whole universe is arising from the more primitive to the more transcendental, and that God is the end of that process, not the beginning, and that just as Tim is not in control of everything, but is the end process of this evolution of this particular person, that God is of the universe, then there's not a being in control of this. There's a love attracting us to it. And the baby is being eaten from the inside because that's biology, and it sucks. And we need to use our wisdom and our compassion to try and stop it. It'll be okay though, because as you say, that child will reincarnate and the soul is immortal because because immortality has evolved. What's come from life and death is something which doesn't experience life and death. And there's something so beautifully redemptive about that. And that the realms that you went so deeply into have emerged, and you can almost see them if you study the literature, which I'm sure you've done, for people's experiences of death and what they think about death. You can just kind of see it evolving, this imaginal world that starts as shades and it's not really there or not there, like the Greeks and before them. And then you get these beginnings of like a projection of life, but better, the happy hunting grounds and all of that sort of stuff, and the drinking halls of Valhalla. And then you start getting the religions emerge, and then it's people with saints, and it feels like, oh, now the collective soul, the communion of psyches is producing this because that's what we've got, and it's to do with different cultures. And then now where it's like everything, cities and rainbows and anything you want, because it's just a huge domain which has emerged based on what we experience here, but into its own reality. And there's something redemptive about that growing up, which really appeals to me, which the top-down thing feels like it's negative.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm not being clear about how that top-down operates.
Okay.
Because for me, the top-down is much more of kind of a guiding wave that has to do with that primordial mind and kind of the sum experience of evolution of consciousness at any time is kind of a measure of that. And so for me, the top-down causality.
What do you mean by the evolution
really,
of consciousness, even? Just before you do, what do you mean by that? Because I'm just worried I might not be understanding you. The evolution of consciousness.
I think it is evolving towards something that we can only see the horizon.
But just going back, you've got the ground of consciousness, which you're starting with, yes? And then it starts evolving. So what's the first thing it does in your narrative? What does the evolution of consciousness look like at the beginning?
How it starts?
Yeah, what is it? Is that involved in, the formation of hydrogen, the formation of consciousness? Is that there? Is that?
Well, I would say the important thing is consciousness preceded that.
Yeah, and so how is it evolving?
That creation of hydrogen, the Big Bang, all those things, and
why is hydrogen consciousness evolving?
I'm not saying it is conscious.
So why is consciousness evolving then?
It's a knowledge, basically a knowledge of self. It's kind of like an experiment that was started by this one mind.
So how in the evolutionary process is it consciousness which is evolving for you?
I would say it's in many ways, it's kind of an understanding of oneness with the universe, understanding of relationship. We're in this perpetual process.
I get that for now, but I want you to go back. I want you to go back to a pre-human time, or, let's talk about the formation of the galaxies. What does that mean to say that that's the evolution of consciousness?
I would say you cannot really look at it going backwards, because it's all forward directed. And from our point of view, it is really about, I would say that the evolutionary step that is, a responsibility of individual Homo sapiens that are incarnated in this epoch has to do with understanding that oneness and connectedness, that, to hurt another is to hurt self. And, but ultimately, we have no clue where it is all headed. I would say, for example, as much as people might think the human brain and mind potentially can envision and imagine everything in the universe, I would say, well, wait a minute. Let's look at, for example, the family dog. The family dog has certain capabilities of understanding, and you can work really hard with that dog to teach them more and more about how the universe works, but there are going to be limits to just how far that dog's understanding can go. And the reality is the human brain, as a projector of this universal mind, also has limits that do not include ultimate reality. We just can't even envision where all this is headed. We can only really see it as we come back into this. I believe that in meditation, in deep epiphanies of contact with the spiritual realm, we can have tremendous insights that help us along those lines. But I think ultimately, when we come back and are in these physical bodies and brains with the limitations that a brain does by filtering consciousness, we just can't really go any further than a certain asymptotic point that is nowhere close to the ultimate goal of this evolution of consciousness. That would be my point there. There's a lot we can see about it and kind of envision about potential teleological kind of drivers. But in essence, we just have to get used to the fact that human brain and mind will never be able to express in this material form the ultimate goal of all of evolution of consciousness. Just as much as the family dog can be taught a lot, but ultimately will not understand something like double special relativity. It's just, I'm sorry. But
Well, I couldn't agree with you more about that. And for me, in my own, just as a human being, let alone as someone who attempts to understand things and share awakened states with people, it ends. Well, I think it was Whitehead who said, philosophy starts with wonder and ends in wonder, and that's
that to me makes perfect sense, and I'm perfectly happy with that.
Yeah,
and it also, I'm very at home with understanding that there is much that I can glean in meditation and I can experience there.
Sure.
That I can never really come back and share adequately with others, except by sharing the technique and allowing them to go in and come to their own understanding. And that's really kind of the goal of the work that Karen and I do in our workshops and Sacred Acoustics and
Good for you.
Mindful Universe, is to try and share that perspective.
So I think the place where we're most in alignment is the most important one, which is when you said, look, I think we're, I forget exactly what you said, but we're moving towards waking up to this fundamental oneness.
Right.
And the thrust of my whole work is about, I call it a movement from individuals to unividuals, who are conscious of unity.
Right.
And everything.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I love that. And I believe that this is actually, as much as we're having this kind of pie in the sky discussion of philosophical points, it is crucial for this world to wake up to this now.
Yes.
The false sense of separation that comes out of reductive materialism in the scientific world has caused tremendous damage in this world. I mean, that's why the chemists, with the divorce of science and technology from our spiritual nature in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, the chemists could make poison gases, machine guns, high explosives for World War I, and then the physicists, nuclear weapons for World War II. I mean, this divorce between science and spirituality has been very damaging, and quantum physics is actually the engine that drives us back towards a unification of our understanding of oneness with the universe. And that's where I think that this kind of discussion is much more important than just the pie in the sky. What are the philosophers of the world going to come to agreement on about all of this information? I think it's crucial. I think our very survival as the human species is absolutely dependent on an awakening to this kind of knowing of the oneness through consciousness and through our discussions of the mind-brain connection. So for me, it's a crucial thing to do day to day to get this out to the world. Because the world must change. Our false sense of separation out of materialist science is deadly, and it wrecks us in that spiritual realm. So this is about kind of bringing it together, growing together. When I say wrecks us, I should point out that obviously I realize that's not true, that all of this is part of a plan for growth and understanding. But it becomes frustrating when you're on this side of the veil and realizing how some of this can help save this world, and yet most of the world still seems oblivious to it.
Yeah, that is, I can absolutely hear you there, Eben. And like you, I think when you touch these deeper places, you become a servant of love, and that becomes what it's about. And my major job, actually, like yours, it sounds like increasingly, is about experience. I run events and work with people, I have done for a very, very long time. Really about, can you have that experience of profound oneness and the enormous love that comes from it. And then my other hat as a thinker is like, well, how the hell can we understand this? And like you, and I think this is why it's been such an animated and lovely conversation, is like, okay, so I think what we know, I think what I sense that both of us know, is that we need to bring this human knowledge together. And we've got a dominant, and in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, we've seen that reductionist paradigm becomes stronger and stronger and stronger until so many people think they're living in a meaningless universe. They're here for 2 minutes and they're gone. And the fact is that's not true.
Right.
And somehow we need, and what we need, and why I passionately have disagreed with you at places and tried to work it out, and why I spend most of my time disagreeing with myself, is because it feels like we need a new vision of what reality is, which is so robust that it can offer a new alternative. Right. And my own journey is like, I don't think the old spiritual story is going to do it, but I think it's got huge important things in it, and somehow we need a new one.
It's had 5,000 years to kind of get the humanity on the right track, and at times it's kind of nudged us correctly, but it really hasn't worked in the big picture. And that's where I think this awakening is so important. And again, what I see is the real difference here is that now the science is what will drive it. The science of non-local consciousness, the science of the brain-mind connection, and the understanding of fundamental nature of reality, enlightened from a viewpoint of quantum physics, much more fully understood than quantum physics has been to date, because the founding fathers of quantum physics were very clear on the primacy of consciousness. It was obvious to them from the experiments. And given John Bell's influence on the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper of 35, all the experiments done since 71 have increasingly put us into a position of realizing that idealism is in many ways the best model, or it's certainly something that implies consciousness is fundamental in driving everything that we see emerging in this universe.
Well, on that beautiful, I think on that note, we should sort of tie our notes, because I have 3 or 4 books of mine behind me which quote all the quantum physicists to go, look, they're all idealists. And now it feels like, well, of course they are, because they were studying Indian philosophy.
One question. Are you familiar with Bernardo Kastrup?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think his book, The Idea of the World, goes a long way towards helping to illuminate a pathway forward.
So I think the book I'm writing is probably to say why I think he's wrong, and why there's a better way of uniting spirituality and science than what I see as a retreat into idealism.
Okay.
And so I want to achieve the same thing. I'm just not at all convinced that this. It's ironic for me, because I've spent so many years trying to create that vision, and it's actually taking off now at the point where I'm going, oh, I think I was wrong. and I find myself moving on to this spiritual emergentism, this view that actually we need to understand it through an evolution, a realization of potentiality, rather than it coming from a consciousness which is already there.
Well, very interesting conversation. I will now dig your book out from the stack.
And please do, and let me know what you think. That would be wonderful.
I'd also be interested in the one that you're working on. So if I can help at all with
thank you.
Reviewing that.
Thank you. That would be, I would love that.
What have you, please do keep me in the loop, because I think you're right. I think we're, in many ways, we're in agreement, and some of this is kind of linguistic and semantic, but some of it is kind of deeply involved with the fundamental kind of principles and observations of the universe, and I love that. So I appreciate your initiating this call, and it's been very opening of my mind to have this discussion, and helps me realize some of the kind of shortcomings of things that I believe and try to teach, and there are ways that I can fine-tune that and improve on it. And I'm fascinated by your work, and therefore, if I can help with the book that you're working on, please let me know.
That's amazingly generous of you. Thank you so much. And I will definitely be back in touch with you and as things develop in the beginning of next year. And it's just for me to say thank you for your generosity of spirit, and for giving your time to talk to me, and for entering in as I kind of hoped and knew you would, into
Yeah.
being able to
Well, I mean,
play
this
with the
stuff,
ideas.
Karen and I live and breathe this stuff. So,
Yeah, I can
and
see.
I love talking with others who are very far along this pathway, as you obviously are. So, very
And wonderful, you know, that you're doing the work you're doing and having the amount of influence in the world that you've had with your book and your work, and that, you know, there's nothing quite like somebody who's been in one thing and then had a powerful movement. It really has a big effect on people. People
this
notice.
is how consciousness evolves, is this very process we're talking about.
That's
So,
exactly right,
we're,
Eben.
we're part of it, which is great.
We are.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you so much, Eben.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
All righty.
Keep me posted. Bye-bye.
Bye.